I want to welcome all of you here. Good afternoon. I'm John Sloop. I'm the chair of NCA's Publications Council right now, professor at Vanderbilt University. I'm really happy to be doing this. This is today's virtual learning opportunity. We titled it Publishing Your Book with the University Press. And even before I go any further here, I just want to thank all the acquisition editors and editors who have joined us, taking time out of their day. And hopefully we can have a talk about a number of different questions we have. VLOs, just to let you know, are exclusive member-only sessions designed to foster connection, learning, and growth within NCA. We're supposed to be doing this as interactive as possible, expert-led presentations. So what I'm going to do is the series is providing space for members to engage with folks, like research, best practices, etc., but also provides the people we invite a chance to talk first, and then we will respond. As part of NCA's broader mission to embrace and enact inclusion, equity, and access, VLOs are also serve as a platform for advocating and advancing principles in communication scholarship, teaching, and professional practice. It's our hope that VLOs are a vital resource for NCA members dedicated to lifelong learning and professional development. As I said, today's VLO will hopefully demystify the academic book publishing process and help you understand the basics of preparing a proposal for a press, how to compile research into book manuscript form, how to respond to and work with reviews, the value of titles, keywords, and all types of other issues. Before we go in, I'm asked to and happy to read a brief land acknowledgement, which also can be found on the NCA website, natcom.org. NCA would like to acknowledge the land the National Office in Washington, D.C. resides on as the ancestral and ceded territory of the Notchtank and Pescataway people. And I know I've blown that, but I will also you'll often hear me mispronouncing all types of words, so you'll forgive me for that. NCA acknowledges that it is often gathered upon unceded lands and that these gatherings manifested the exclusions and erasures of many indigenous peoples. We acknowledge the grave harm that colonialism brought to these lands, in particular the erasure of both indigenous and African identities via slavery, racist laws, and segregated all peoples into binary classifications of white and black. This acknowledgement demonstrates our commitment to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. So I'm asked to read that, but I'm going to add one little editorial comment. I think these land acknowledgement statements and these statements that organizations are doing are needed and necessary. But to be quite frank, I think that they're just a start, and we understand rhetoric's important and saying that's important. But I urge you in your own ways, if you want to take these seriously, what we did in taking over land, and donations to different causes that help support indigenous peoples or people harmed by slavery, et cetera, are also a way of materially manifesting change, right? So anyway, that's just my editorial comment. NCA did not add that on there. So if you have an issue with that, bring it up with me later. Speakers, we have an excellent lineup of speakers today who will be answering questions and sort of a roundtable interview. I'll be asking some questions, they'll answer them. Speakers are Terrace Cyphers, acquisition to editor at Ohio State University Press, Aurora Bell, acquisition to editor at the University of South Carolina Press, Kristen Hopp, acquisitions editor at University of Alabama Press, Archana Patel, acquisitions editor at Pennsylvania State University Press, and Judith LaCamper. Judith, you can just, when you answer a question, say, here's how Sloop fouled up my name. Senior acquisitions editor at Michigan State University Press. Nicole Solano, who is the director and associate press director at Rutgers University Press, couldn't be with us, had wanted to earlier. And I want to raise that because I want to make sure that press stays on your radar as we're going through this. So here's how this is going to work. I'm going to moderate today's program, help field questions, and at the end. So feel free to drop any questions in the chat room that come up that aren't answered as we're going through, or use the Zoom's raise hand feature when prompted when we get to that point. But we won't answer questions until we've gone through the series of panels, but we want to have some time for that. So again, I'm going to get started here, and I will ask questions, and then I will try to sit back and let them answer, and then go on to the next one. Let's start out with this. How do you identify the right press for your book?
Hi, everyone. I'm happy to take that first question. Thank you, first of all, to John and Rachel and NCA for having us all here. I'm delighted to be here. Um, so this is a great time to start researching presses. And I always say the best place to start is your bookshelf. You want to look for books that have been published in the last 3 to 5 years and think about who's publishing the books that you're most excited about. The other thing to do right now is to start surveying the current publishing landscape. In other words, you want to figure out who's actively publishing in your area. Academic conferences, the exhibit hall at those conferences is a great way to do that, with the goal of figuring out who's attending conferences that matter to you and what they're showcasing. So, for example, at Penn State, we publish in many area studies like Latin American studies or Africana studies, but neither of those lists include criminology. So if you're someone that goes to the criminology conference, you'll notice that we don't have a booth there. There's no editors there. And that's something that you should be aware of if you want your book to be at a specific conference, talking to a specific audience. You can still do this work in the virtual space because presses are doing creative things to get the word out about their books, ranging from virtual exhibit halls to social media campaigns. I always recommend looking at past conference programs, which almost always list past exhibitors as a jumping off point to start exploring press websites. If you're on social media, follow editors, follow presses, pay attention to conference hashtags, which I find that presses use more than attendees, so you can get a sense of what's going on at a press. Um, I also always recommend signing up for subject-specific e-newsletters for fields that you're interested in. So for example, when you go onto the Penn State Press website, you can sign up for our general email newsletter, but you can also sign up for the one on art or history. I'll leave it there and turn it over to Aurora.
Sure, thank you. Thank you as well for having us here, NCA and John. We really appreciate it. Just to add on a couple of things to what Archana already shared, the Association of University Presses has a really wonderful resource. It's a subject area grid. It's fairly easy to find on that website, but it lists all of the university presses that are members of that association, about 130 of them, and all of the scholarly subjects that you can think of. And so you can cross-reference those things and find a really comprehensive list of which presses are publishing in your area. And then from there, go on their website to find out what kinds of books they're publishing, what are they interested in today versus 15 years ago. Thank you, Tara, for dropping in that link. That's wonderful. So that is a resource that I love to send people to. I think it's especially helpful if you're doing interdisciplinary work, because a lot of university presses, the editor may acquire in a specific area, but they may have colleagues who are going to other conferences that are relevant to you. And so there may be maybe opportunities for that kind of synergy across our lists. Certainly we see it at South Carolina, where I'm acquiring in rhetoric and communication. I have another colleague who is acquiring in African American studies. He's at the ASALA conference right now. And so there are books that I acquire that are primarily living in rhetoric that he's going to take to that conference, just as one example. So I think that the subject area grid is a really helpful way to get that sort of bigger picture without having to start by digging around too much. So that's one thing to really pay attention to. And then I think Archana, you really covered all the other major points. So I'll leave it there and let us move on. John, you're muted.
I know. I was having trouble getting it unmuted. I apologize. Thank you for those answers. Every time I listen to you guys speak, I learn something more about the process, and I appreciate that. I want to draw people's attention, and this might happen during the meeting. Tara put over a link in the chat room in the chat box to the press, and there might be some of that else going on too. Second question is, and I know we think about this a lot as authors. There's something different about the manuscript and the proposal. So what makes for a strong proposal when you guys are reading them?
I can start here. You did not do any harm to my name, by the way. Judith LeCamper is how I usually say it. The proposal, I think, sometimes can be a really daunting document to write, especially for first-time authors. And I typically like to say that it really shouldn't be or doesn't have to be. I think once you think about sort of what it does and what the purpose of it is, it becomes a lot more clear. And since everybody in this discipline has a good sense of how genres work, that's always a good place to start. So the proposal itself is a very functional genre. So that makes it a little bit easier. For most university presses, you'll probably, if you go on their website or you communicate with an editor, they can give you a very specific set of questions that usually we need to have answered. All of the questions typically fall into 2 or 3 different categories of questions. One is sort of like, what is the book about? What is the main argument that you're going to make? Why should we publish it? And then who's going to read it? Those kinds of questions about target audience and how the press fits into that target audience. And then there's typically a third set of questions that really is very that just asks some specific questions about what the book is going to look like. How long do you think it's going to be? What's your timeline to completion? And those kinds of things. And those are all questions that if we decide to offer a contract, those are all little facts that likely will show up in the contract. So those are the different types of questions. I think what's important when you start working on the proposal is to really think about, to take a step back from the project, and that can be hard for authors sometimes, and work from a meta level and remember that it is a text about your text. So sometimes I get proposals that sort of summarize or re-narrate the argument that the book is making. And that's not very helpful, that's not always helpful, especially if you keep in mind that your acquisitions editor may not be, or is most likely not an expert in the area that you're working in. They have, a very good sort of in-depth understanding from the work that they've done, but they're not an active scholar in the field. So the most important thing, like I said, just sort of telling the author what is the book, or telling the press, telling the acquisitions editor and the other people at the press, what is the book about? And so the strongest proposals, I think, have a very clear sense of the argument that they're making and the scholarly contribution that they're making. So we typically ask you to put yourself into some kind of conversation with other books that have recently published. So for me, a red flag in a proposal that I sometimes see is, nobody has ever done anything like this before. Because again, thinking back to what I started out with, what I'm trying to assess when I read a proposal is who's going to read this. And so the question of what are comparable titles helps me understand who's going to likely read the book. And then I can ask myself, do I have access to that audience? So the contribution is important, the audience is important, the market is important, and then and this is just sort of just a side comment, that something that I've recently been more attuned to is sometimes I scan the proposal a little bit for the author personality. What kind of an author is this person that I'm working with? Are they receptive to certain the needs of the press, or what the requirements that we have and things like that? That's not like the first question. That's not a question that I start out with, but it's definitely something that is sort of always going on in the background for me as an acquisitions editor when I'm reading a proposal. I don't think that's a comprehensive list, and I'm sure that others have more perspective on this, so I'll hand it over.
Yeah, I would second everything that you said there, Judith. I think those are all really good points about what makes for a strong proposal, especially that part about argument and also understanding above that level, what's the intervention that the argument is making. That's really key. To that, I would just add that the sample chapter descriptions are always something that I read very, very carefully. to get a better sense of the arc of the book, the narrative of the book. And what I'm looking at there is not just the particular case studies that you're going to be looking at, the data. I also want to know, how do those case studies then connect back to whatever the central driving argument is for the book and what you see as your intervention? So you're looking at this, how does it connect back to whatever that central argument is? What is the sub-argument, the sub-claim that chapter is making with that data that connects back to the bigger picture? And that's really important for the overall cohesion of the book. I always like to say that the good proposals function a bit like a mini version of the introduction. So it gives us that same kind of introduction to the project, a snapshot of the entire project. It introduces us to whatever the subject matter is, a little bit of context and rationale. Importantly, the argument and contribution, the scholarship that you're in conversation with, who are you building on, methodology, those kinds of things. So I would kind of think of your book proposal a bit like that as well, because typically I think a lot of authors aren't submitting an introduction along with a book proposal. So the book proposal is kind of your chance to have like a shortened version of that. And it can also help you kind of work out some of those things that you're planning on doing in the introduction. I also wanted to touch on just the timing of the book proposal as well. And just like, when should you start to think about putting together a book proposal? And I would say with that, you typically, I would say, want to have about at least 2 body chapters drafted of the book. And the reason for that is because, you know, as you get into your case studies, your examples, your data, you may find things out about your argument that you thought you were making that differs actually, and it can change things. And so I think, you know, having at least 2 body chapters drafted, your 3rd chapter maybe really robustly outlined, and you've already looked at the case studies and the data, maybe it's just not fully fleshed out. You want to have at least that much to be able to then turn your attention to something like a book proposal. So that's my advice there.
I would say I agree with everything Judith and Tara have already said. I have a few points I'll just reiterate. The first being, you know, definitely go to AUPresses website and make sure you're familiar with what material they're requesting in a proposal. It is going to be really similar across the presses, but it's always good to do your homework and make sure you have checked every box on the list that they're giving you. And again, I think the understanding the audience of a proposal is so important. You know, the first person who's going to be reading and reacting and responding to it is us, the acquisitions editors. And again, we're usually not subject matter experts in the fields that we acquire in. But even beyond that, you know, we might share and discuss proposals with our other acquisitions colleagues who are even more far afield from a particular discipline, or even our colleagues in sales and marketing to get their perspective on things. So in an ideal scenario, a proposal is, you know, well written, but also digestible enough for me to then go have a quick conversation with our sales manager and talk to him and be able to explain it to him eloquently. Beyond that, I think the area of proposals I see people struggle with the most is the comparable books. What books is your work in conversation with section? And I think there might be a little bit of a misunderstanding in what makes for a comparable title. We're not necessarily looking for books that are doing the exact same thing you're doing on the exact same subject matter with the exact same methodology. We are looking for books with similar qualities, and maybe it's just one of those elements. Maybe it's just a similar subject matter, or maybe it's just a similar methodology. You know, even a book that is of a similar size and scope or time frame can be really helpful. Yeah, so again, to reiterate Judith's point, saying there's never been a book like this before, I have no comps for you, can often be a bit of a red flag, if at least not like a yellow flag, I suppose. What else did I have? Oh, beyond that, on occasion, when it comes to sample chapters, people will ask me, well, I have a journal article that I've published and I intend to revise it and include it in the manuscript. Can you use my article as a sample chapter? And the answer there is unfortunately no, because it's not really pre-revised version of an article doesn't really show me what it's going to look like in book form. I would much rather you wait until you have actually taken on those revisions and edited it in a way that would be appropriate for a book chapter. And then my last little piece of advice is one that I've added to this little spiel here very recently, and that is a plea to not use AI to write your book proposals. Here recently, I had a really unfortunate situation where a proposal came to me for a manuscript that I was really excited about. And unfortunately, there were just clear signs of AI usage that were not ignorable for me or the series editors. And we did have to decline that work. And that made me very sad. So please don't use AI to write your proposals.
I found the answers to that really informative. The AI bit is interesting. I mean, I've had so many people now using AI for different things that surprise me. And I mean, I do think it's a good starting point sometimes to get some ideas from, but people are going to have to learn to use it for that way. I mean, in these cases, Tara, I just wanted to say I especially liked your discussion of why having more than 2 chapters solidly done. But I've often thought the reason for that was just you wanted to make sure people were going to have a manuscript, but the idea that your argument changes in the process is pretty key and insightful. Something people often ask is how do you first approach an editor? How do you guys like to have people talk to you, through what means, what should they say, etc.?
So I can jump in here and say that when you are ready or thinking about approaching an editor, I think the biggest misconception is that you have to wait until you fully finish the project before doing so. Actually, it's the complete opposite. If you are working on that first book, you should definitely be making some serious headway into revising that dissertation. But you should try to connect with an editor beforehand. You know, we receive hundreds of proposals and queries over email. We do read and review each and every single one of them, but cold emailing an editor isn't always the best way to get in touch. If you connect with us beforehand, we're then in a much better position to look out for your proposal and to take a closer look when you do submit it. Again, academic conferences are a great moment to connect with an editor face-to-face. If you do want to meet with an editor at a conference, I always recommend reaching out like a month or so beforehand, before the start of the conference. If you wait until the week of or the day of, chances are it'll be too late, and most editors will have already filled their schedules. I know at the conference itself, I always try to block out time to be in the booth. But again, if you try to swing by, there's a chance that you may miss us, or we're busy helping someone else out. So requesting a meeting is a great way to go. If you do book a meeting, it's helpful to send a proposal beforehand to give us some background information. I will say, and I repeat this quite often, this does not mean that we'll be fluent on the project by the time we meet. You know, there is something about being in meeting number 15, you know, you're stuck in some little gray room for a couple hours, not seeing any sunlight. It messes with your mind a little bit, but it's still helpful. Even if you do submit the proposal, I still may ask you the same basic questions. Don't start with the chapter by chapter breakdown. What I want to hear about is, what is the book about? Why do you care about it? And why should I? And this may seem repetitive, but I found that people are much better at answering these questions clearly and with some passion in a conversation rather than just in the proposal. So I like to approach these meetings as having a conversation over a cup of coffee. You tell me things, I ask some questions, and we suss out the answers together. Another reason why these meetings, whether they're in person or over Zoom, are really a conversation, not a presentation, is that you should also feel free to ask questions. This is your opportunity to figure out if this is the right home for your project and if this is the editor that you want to work with. Your goal should be to find an editor who's excited about your work. And that's because your editor ends up becoming your advocate at the press. They're the ones building excitement about the project with their colleagues. They're the ones you go to when there's a problem. You want to find someone who you think really gets your book and is excited about it. Ideally, you should have a collaborative partnership with your publishing house, and you want to pick a home where you feel like your work is valued. I'll leave it there for now.
I really appreciate that. I think the I don't want to editorialize too much on these, but I really like the idea that it's not a sales pitch so much as a conversation to sort of find the right fit, and I think that's very important. I know that I get a lot of questions from junior colleagues, but also from all types of people, and I also had this sort of anxiety myself, and that's about the review process. So I'd like one of you to address how peer reviewers are chosen. And my understanding is this, and unlike journals, this is not double blind, but it's a blind review process. At least we don't know who the reviewers are. How do you choose them? How long does that process normally take? What do I expect? What can I expect when I do get the reports back? That type of thing. Well, and this is relevant to journal authors as well, but I think it's very important in these books. Where can the author push back on something the reviewers have said, and are you as acquisition editors helping the author understand what they can and can't do?
Thank you so much. I'll take this one. So to answer the sort of first part of that question, the sort of flippant answer about how do we choose peer reviewers is very carefully. But it really is, such an important part of the process for everyone who's involved. Presses will vary on whether or not they ask authors to make suggestions about reviewers, and they also vary as regards what they do with that information. I do like to have suggestions because even if I don't end up reaching out to any of those people, sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. But it gives me a sense of who you think are the right kind of people to review your work, where they're positioned within the discipline, and other matters. Especially if the work is interdisciplinary, having the author's sense of who would be good reviewers can be really helpful as well. But then the editor ultimately is going to, generate their own list based on, again, these ideas from the author, our own knowledge of the field, our own contacts, and start reaching out to people. And the outreach and eventual review timelines can really vary. I would say that the timeline difference for proposals versus manuscripts is not as large as you would think, because proposals themselves with sample chapters are quite substantial. And a chunk of the time is really that outreach to find the right reviewers. So we're reaching out to just a couple of people at a time, waiting. Do they respond? Do they say yes? Do they say no before you reach out to more folks? So that process itself can take several weeks. And then the reviews usually are going to take a couple of months, and whether that is, 2 months or 4 months varies. But your editor, once they get the reviews lined up, they should be able to let you know when you can expect feedback. And then we try to, stay on top of the reviewers and to update authors if there are changes to that schedule, because sometimes things do come up in review. Someone, has an emergency and needs a couple extra weeks. Sometimes someone disappears. So we are also managing that part of it as well. And then when you get the reports back, your editor may just send them directly to you without a lot of commentary, or they may intervene in some of those points and say, I see that reader 1 and reader 2 have very different opinions about chapter 2 and what you should do with it. So pay special attention to that and let's discuss which way you're leaning. But it really does become a conversation, assuming that the reviews are, reasonably positive. You're somewhere in the range of revise and resubmit up to this is very close to being ready for publication. You're entering into a dialogue with those anonymous reviewers as well as your editor. And they can really help sort of guide you in terms of if there are things you really disagree with, is that something that might be a sticking point for the press or for the faculty board that's ultimately going to approve the project? So we can really help guide authors through all of those things. There may be places where the author and the reviewers are sort of at loggerheads, and the acquisitions editor feels very strongly that the reviewers are making the right point here. So there are times when we invite an author to revise and resubmit and the author decides not to do that, and that's perfectly fine. But we really can be partners in that process to figure out appropriate responses. Certainly when we ask you to write a revision memo, reviewing that and confirming that the tone is going to come across in a constructive and productive way to all the different people who need to read it. And yeah, working through those questions together. So I think I'll leave it there.
No, that's great. That's very helpful. I may follow up myself with a couple of questions about this later, but let's let that lay now for what it was. I think you did a very nice job with that. So we're going on in the process. I've revised it. Your press is now about to offer me a contract. And I know that in the first book I published, I found the number of questions about the contract and what responsibilities were things I'd never thought about whatsoever. So what should I be as an author? What should I be especially attentive to in the contract in terms of what are the questions? What are you looking for? What has to be settled before we move forward?
Yeah, this is a really great question that I'm sure a lot of people are curious about. So I'm going to do my best to cover as much as I possibly can in a succinct amount of time. So if I start going on too long, someone please feel free to give me a wave and tell me to wrap it up. But I'll get to as much as I can. Just for starters, usually most presses have two kinds of contracts that they might be offering you. One is called an advance contract or a contingency contract. Those names are kind of used interchangeably. And then the other is a standard contract. And there are a couple of key differences between these two kinds of contracts. An advance contract is offered at some point prior to the completion, the peer review, and or the editorial board acceptance of a manuscript. So usually when an advance contract is being offered is after a proposal and sample chapters have been submitted and perhaps there has been a peer review of the proposal and it has come back favorably. Otherwise, a standard contract is offered after the completion, the peer review, and the editorial board acceptance of a manuscript. So that big difference is where are we in the process and where is the manuscript in its development. The main differences in the contracts themselves pertain to a couple of things. One is the due date that your contract will have. If we are talking about an advance contract, the due date will be for the review ready manuscript. So the manuscript that is sufficient for the purpose of peer review. Otherwise, in a standard contract, your due date is going to be the due date for the final manuscript, the version of the manuscript that is going to follow all of our manuscript preparation guidelines and entered into the editorial and production pipeline for copy editing, proofreading, and so on. Otherwise, the big difference with an advance contract is that there is what's called a contingency clause in it, which is why it's sometimes called a contingency contract, that says that publication of the work is contingent upon satisfactory peer review of the full manuscript, and final approval of the work by the editorial board. So it's saying that these terms must be met in order for this contract to be considered fully active and for the press to have an obligation to publish your book. Otherwise, the terms in a standard contract versus an advanced contract are essentially identical. And some of the big main points that you can expect to see are, one, what rights are you granting to the press via this contract? The three main categories for this is the exclusivity, the territory rights, and the languages. In terms of exclusivity, a contract is either exclusive or non-exclusive, and almost always for a book contract, we are going to be looking at an exclusive transfer of rights, because that means that the press has exclusive rights to publish your work and no one else, you are not able to grant anyone else the rights to publish your work for the duration of the copyright. The territory rights refers to where the press is able to sell your book. So for the most part, you are going to see something like world rights, which means that we can sell it anywhere throughout the world. On the world market, you might see North American rights or something like that, that is, you know, a little bit narrower. But that's what that does, is say where the press is allowed to sell your book or not allowed to sell your book. And then also the languages, the standard for us is to be granted all languages. So this means that we would be able to negotiate translation rights for you, but in some circumstances and some presses might have a preference for English language rights only, which means that the press would only be able to publish your book in the English language. Beyond that, there's also a subset of rights called secondary rights or subsidiary rights that have to do with derivatives of your book. So this is, you know, anything that is based on the original material of the book but exists in a different format. So this includes translation rights, like I just mentioned, but also dramatization, radio, television, audiobook, motion pictures, anything like that that we consider a derivative. So the contract will outline which of those secondary rights you are granting to your publisher. Let's see, beyond that, there are some standard terms that also have to be outlined, such as the manuscript delivery date, like I already mentioned, the size of the manuscript. It will say what your maximum amount of words is for the manuscript, as well as how many illustrations you can include in the interior of the book. It will also say whether those illustrations can be in color or can be in black and white. There will be a clause that discusses your duties as the author, which kind of boils down to, yes, you will meet the deadlines you're asked to meet. You will do what is asked of you in terms of copy editing and proofreading. You will not allow others to publish any part of the book without the press's permission. And it will also tell you what your responsibility is regarding the index. For us, our authors are responsible for producing the index themselves. So that is in our contract. Depending on what a particular press's policy is, that might vary, but it should be explicitly stated somewhere what they expect you to do regarding the index. There will also be a section that outlines your royalty rates, and this will be broken down by format. So you'll have a royalty rate for hardback books, for paperbacks, and for ebooks. And your royalty rates can either be a flat rate, so X% net on all sales, or it could have escalations, which means that on the first 500 copies sold, you get X%. On the next 500 copies sold, you get Y%, and then maybe anything thereafter, you know, after 1,000 copies sold, you get Z%. And you can also, for the most part, expect for your royalties to be off of net receipts, which is what the customer paid for the book minus whatever publication costs went into an individual copy. So if your book is being sold for $20, you know, that's the list price. But the net receipts might be $12. So you would get X% of $12, not the $20. This area of the contract will also tell you when you will get paid, how often you can expect to get cut a check for your royalties. Usually, we're looking at a kind of annual schedule. So once a year, first you'll get a royalty statement from your publisher that says, here's what we are paying you, here's a breakdown of where all of this money is coming from. And then after that, you will receive the actual check itself or direct deposit. And then the contract will also usually say what the minimum amount is that your royalties have to accrue to before your publisher will pay out those royalties. So it might say that, you know, we have to owe you at least $50 to cut you a check. So if you only make $45 in royalties this year, we'll send you a royalty statement, but we're not going to cut you a check. We're just going to let it roll over to next year, and you'll get it next year after you hit that minimum requirement. The contract will also outline the press's responsibilities regarding copyright registration. I would say most of the time you can expect for the publisher to be the responsible party in terms of registering for the copyright of a book. It is technically possible for that to be an author's responsibility, but I would expect for that to be something the press will do for you. It will also say whether or not they intend to register the book in the press's name or in your name. And I suppose if someone has questions about like the pros and cons of that, we can get into it. But for the sake of time, I'll leave it there. And then it will also say that the press is going to protect the rights to your work and protect it from any infringement or piracy or anything like that. And that is also a part of the purpose of that area of the contract. Your contract will also say how many copies of the book you will receive upon publication, and also what your discount will be to buy additional copies from the press. There will also be a section that outlines the terms for rights reversions or the termination of the contract, which maybe sounds a little bit scary for that to even be a possibility, but it is really for an author's protection to have those terms outlined in case, you know, there's ever a situation where, you know, oftentimes one of the requirements here is that the press keeps your book in print or available for sale in some format. And if your publisher no longer meets that criteria, then maybe you want to have the rights reverted back to you and own all of the rights to your book again. So, you know, it's not usually a term that is going to come into effect anytime soon, but, you know, we're thinking about the longevity and the lifetime of your book and making sure that you are being served 10 years down the road, 15 years down the road, 20 years down the road, and so on. There will also be a section in your contract about the publication, sale, and marketing of your book that says that the press will publish it within a certain window of time, barring any kind of catastrophic, unpredictable events, and that the press will market the work to the best judgment, which means that the press gets to decide what price they're going to sell the book at, when the book is going to be published, what kind of discount rates they might offer to retailers in order to incentivize them to stock your book, and also that the press has final say on both the title of your book and the cover design of your book, because those are, at the end of the day, marketing and sales tools. In an ideal situation, the title and cover is something that you've settled on with your editor and that you feel good about. But if it is, you know, for any reason, you know, some kind of compromise can't be made, the press does get to have final say in what those elements are. And then something that's kind of becoming a growing common factor in contracts is, again, talking about AI. Some presses do already have language in their contracts about AI and AI usage and that sort of thing. We're still developing a new contract term to go into our contracts that outlines, you know, what our policy about AI is. I can say what that will probably end up looking like is a requirement for disclosure. So if you have used AI in any way, you will be required to disclose that to the press at the bare minimum. Although your contract will also say that, you know, this is a new and original work that you are claiming to be the owner of. So there is already language, base language in standard book contracts that do have some kind of relationship to the evolving AI landscape. In terms of what is negotiable, what is not negotiable in a book contract, I mean, you might be a little surprised to find that a lot of it is negotiable. We can negotiate what kind of rights you want to grant to us to an extent. You know, if you really want if you know, having your book translated is really important to you, maybe you decide you want to retain translation rights. So you only give us English language rights and we remove translation from your subsidiary rights section. So, you know, that's something that you can be in conversation with your editor about. You know, you can negotiate your royalty rights to a degree. You know, I would say any kind of, no unreasonable request should, you know, go unanswered. There is no harm in asking. The worst thing that can happen if you're trying to negotiate terms is that your editor will say no, but they're not going to say no, and we no longer want to publish your book. Like, that's not on the table. So if there's something you're looking to negotiate, it doesn't hurt to ask, so long as you're going into it with kind of a reasonable mindset. In terms of things that are not negotiable, these are things like, what are your duties as an author, and those kinds of terms about how the press will market and sell the book to the best of its abilities, and what the press gets the final say in. And, you know, despite all of this, you might get a book contract and still be kind of overwhelmed with what is going into what's in it. And I would say that's what your editors should be able to explain any terms in the contract that you might have questions about or not understand, or just not understand the benefit of having them, or where the press is coming from. So your editor can talk you through that. What your editor can't do is give you legal advice. If you want legal advice, you need a lawyer, and we're not lawyers. If you're looking for other resources or other people to be in conversation with about your contract, you know, you're allowed to share it with your colleagues or any kind of mentors you might have. I've also had some authors get a contract review through the Authors Guild. I do think you have to pay for it, but you will get a lot of feedback there, although I do find that is usually with an eye to kind of like trade commercial publishing, but that is available to you as well. And I think I've hit all of the major points, and I've been talking for a while, so I'll call it there.
Appreciate it. I knew this question was going to be one that was going to take a lot of response, because there is a lot to think about in that process. I found it very helpful also to talk to people who had published with presses when I got the contract, because the first time you see one, it is sort of, it's almost charming to realize that there's stuff in there about dramatizing your book or putting it in film, as if that's going to happen. But anyway, it feels good to have that in the contract. I want to, we have two more questions I'm going to ask you guys, but I want to make sure and assure those of you who are here asking questions that we're going to get to those right after that. So I'm not ignoring those questions. We're going to get to those after we finish here. Let's throw this to Tara. This is a really important question, especially for junior faculty members, in terms of getting a book finished and out, etc. How long does the publishing process itself take? What can I expect from the process? What are my responsibilities as an author, etc., that type of thing?
Yeah, I'm going to post a link in the chat to a graphic that shows the life cycle of a book. This is put out by our colleagues at the University Press of Florida, but I feel like it's a really nice overview of the entire process, some of which we've already covered, a lot of the acquisition stuff. And I'm going to turn to the editorial and production phase next. But before I go into kind of the blue line in the graphic, if you're looking at that, copy editing and all of that, I did want to say that your responsibilities start right away. Some of the editorial and production responsibilities start even when you submit your final manuscript to your acquisitions editor, because sometimes there are certain formatting requirements that presses might have. Like, we need you to split up the files, or we need you to have, you know, it's spaced in a certain kind of way. Or if you have images, we need you to write alt text for those images, because a lot of presses are thinking about accessibility. And so we want to make sure that we have alt text and long descriptions for images and things like that. And when you submit that final manuscript to your acquisitions editor, they will often also collect a series of other forms that are going to drive editorial production and the marketing of your book. So, for example, a cover design form where you can express some of your cover design preferences or suggest possible images. Permissions documents. Authors are typically responsible for collecting permissions and rights to any third-party content, whether that's images or previously published materials, a marketing questionnaire, things like that. So your responsibilities kind of already start at that phase. Once we get into editorial and production, so after you've submitted your final manuscript to the acquisitions editor, that process typically takes 10 to 12 months on average. There's slight variations between presses. So this could be one of the questions that you ask your acquisitions editor. And it's important to have a pretty good answer and a good idea about the timeline, because you want to be thinking about what are your tenure and promotion requirements if you're going to be using this book for those purposes. How does everything time out, you know, to align with whatever your requirements are? So it's an important question to ask. I would say on average it's 10 to 12, 10 to 14 months, something like that. In terms of your responsibilities, then you will be involved in several phases of editorial and production, starting with the copy edited manuscript. So a press will have your manuscript copy edited, and those changes are typically track changes in Microsoft Word, and you'll have a chance to review all those. And we're hoping that you'll just love all the changes and agree with them. But if there are some that you don't agree with, you have a chance to express that at that point in the process. And make any other final minor edits. And for the most part, presses are hoping that you will only make minor changes, no big rewrites or additions or anything like that. Just mostly minor stuff. You'll also have a chance then to review what we call the proof. So after all of the edits are finalized, things are moved forward into production, they're typeset, and that's where the interior of your book is designed. You get pagination on the book. And so you'll have a chance to also review at least one proof, if not two proofs. Again, this can kind of vary press to press, but you'll at least see one proof. And at that first proof stage, that is when you will compose the index, either do that yourself or pay to have it done. Kristen mentioned that's usually something that's mentioned in the contract as a requirement from authors. The other thing that you'll be involved in during the editorial and production phase is the cover design process. So you'll have a chance to see your front cover and approve the design, a chance to review the full cover as well. And you'll get looped in on usually approving what we call like the marketing copy, the blurbs for your book, things like that. So typically we collect a draft from you as the author, something that describes your book, and then sometimes the acquisitions editor will do a little bit of work on that copy, and then finally marketing will also do some work on that copy to make sure that it's going to appeal to its audiences, and you'll have a chance to review things after that's done.
Okay, so man, a couple of these questions are going to be sort of interesting. I'm looking forward to hearing your answers. But Judith, let's turn to you for this. What do I do once my book is published? Do I just sort of sit back, or do I have responsibilities once it comes out in terms of getting words out or et cetera?
Yeah, thank you, John. I think that's another really important question because a lot of authors get to sort of to the finished product and they think, you know, their work is done and now they can send it out into the world and it will do its thing. And unfortunately, that's not necessarily always the case. So there are a lot of things that you can still do once you get to those final stages to help increase visibility. And obviously the press has a marketing team and they will do some marketing. And I saw one question in the chat, so I might, you know, touch on that a little bit, but partially the type of marketing that your book will receive does depend on what type of book it is. So if it's a scholarly book, it will be marketed a little bit differently and in different places than a trade book. For university presses, I can, you know, that might be something to touch on a little bit more later, but I know that for Michigan State University Press, pretty much the only trade books that we do are regional titles. And everything else that we do is scholarly monographs. So I'll focus on that for the type of marketing that we do. So typically the university, the press will attend conferences. We've already talked about those. You know, we put out catalogs. We have mailing lists that go to scholars and libraries in the different fields that we publish in, those types of things. But on top of that, there are a lot of things that I think you as an author can do to help bring visibility to your book. And I know that I've had a lot of conversations with authors. I know that a lot of academics out there are not big fans of self-promotion. But I just want to encourage everybody to do that because you spend a lot of time working on the book and it deserves to be seen. But unless you're Stephen King, there's not going to be sort of like an automatic, visibility to it. So we've already talked a little bit, Tara just talked a little bit about the marketing questionnaire. The marketing questionnaire, that's sort of still pre-finished book where you can start thinking about this. The marketing questionnaire allows you to give some input into the cover, list key terms. So one of the things that you'll want to think about as you get to that point is there used to be, well, I won't get derailed, but a lot of our books are found through search engines, right? And so it is helpful to think about how search engines work. And so you, as the author, know best what key terms you want to sort of like pop up in response to. So what would somebody be searching for whom your book would be really interesting? And those key terms should be in the marketing questionnaire. And ideally also in the title. So one thing that I would also recommend for authors is once you get to sort of like the final stages, if an editor comes back to you and says, I've shared this, with production, we're working on it, marketing, everybody's really excited about the book, we do want to suggest some tweaks to the title. I would encourage you to have an open mind about that. I know that's hard. A lot of people are invested in the title. They've worked on the manuscript, thinking about it in certain terms. The press does not want to ruin your vision for the book. They want to help your book be seen by as many people as possible. And the title is a huge piece in that. So just having an open mind, thinking about how can we sort of have an interesting title, an inspiring title that also helps us sort of hit those search engine requirements. And then post-production, there are a few things that publishers do and where we rely on your input. Most publishers initially will send out review copies to different outlets. So you'll get another marketing questionnaire, or I think for us, it's 2 marketing questionnaires. Other presses might have it in 1. But there's usually a question about, who do you think is most likely to review the book? So there's a little bit of a responsibility to think about, not just about, do I want to see my book in, X, Y, and Z outlet? But where am I going to be most likely to have a review published? The same thing goes for awards. So we usually ask for, or most presses, I think, and that varies a little bit about how many award applications they support and whatnot. That's something to sort of touch base with the marketing folks or your editor as well. but suggests awards where you have a likelihood that you might actually win an award. So in other words, if something is an award for a first book, but this is not your first book, make sure that you think about those criteria before you suggest something to the press. Obviously, we count on you to use your own network. So if you're active in social media, you will likely have materials that you can share on social media. Usually you'll get some kind of a discount code from the press that anybody can use. So we would, we always encourage our authors, if you're on Facebook, if you're on Blue Sky, if you're on LinkedIn, make sure that you're out there spreading the word. LinkedIn, is a way you can sometimes, even share like excerpts from a book. Obviously, you don't want to share like large chunks, but you can talk to your editor about how much am I allowed to put out there. So you can share some of the actual content. I understand sort of that we don't want to necessarily ask people to buy a book, but one thing that you can do that I like to recommend is to ask everybody in your network that's not at the same university as you to put in a request with the university library for them to order it. Because what I've seen in the 6 or 7 years that I've been an acquisitions editor for an academic press is that there used to be sort of like an automatic purchase button from university libraries, but they don't do that anymore. The library budgets are down, so university librarians really depend on recommendations, and that's something that doesn't cost the other person anything. But it builds a network, and scholars can work together and support each other in that way. And that way, your book will end up in the library. Another thing that you can do, obviously, we love for you to attend conferences. Sometimes there will be overlap. Sometimes you'll be at the same conferences as we are. It's good to let your editor know ahead of time so that they can plan. Maybe they can make sure that they have extra books. Maybe they can plan a signing. Every press sort of handles that differently. If you go to attend conferences where maybe your press isn't present, let them know that too. I know that for us, you can go to our website. If you've published with us, you can get flyers, you can order bookmarks, you can order postcards, you can order all sorts of promotional things that we will send you that you can take to conferences and spread out. So that's another way that you can spread the word. And then one final idea that's a little bit further out there is what you can do is outlets like the Chronicle of Higher Education have little like blog series, and the one for the Chronicle of Higher Ed is called The Conversation. If you have a topic that's in any way sort of contemporary, current, you can pitch a blog post, and that's a good opportunity for people to read, read your work, read about what you're doing, and put a plug and reach an audience that's a little bit bigger than what maybe your press has access to if they're limited to the particular disciplines that you're publishing in. I think that covers, there's probably more, but I think those are sort of the most important, the core things that I typically talk about when it comes to this. But happy to take questions on that later too.
I want to do this is first off, I want to underline what you said about the conversation. I swear I've written 3 pieces for them, not that they put out there, and the number of readers on those is so far outside anything journal articles, etc. And having you as the author of a book as a result of that, I don't know that sells tons of copies, but at least it gets your names out there, has you as author of blank book. And the conversation's been remarkable for me in terms of other types of outlets, getting other types of chances to speak to people. So I really want to emphasize that. Here's what I want to do. I'm going to go through the questions that have been asked while we have time, but I'm going to ask one of you to respond to the questions, right, instead of having a free-for-all, and we'll go down the line that way. And then, but if the acquisition editor, if you think something needs to be added, please jump in after they go. Tara, I'm going to start with you on this one. How challenging is it for an early career faculty to publish from university press rather than other presses? And I guess the heart of this question is not just how much more challenging it is, but what do you see as the difference for somebody thinking about it? I obviously put this together as a university press panel because I know that's important for a lot of tenure and promotion committees. And I know you guys all do good work, but what are the differences? What should authors be thinking about in terms of that?
Yeah, I mean, one of my first thoughts to answer this question was going to be what you just pointed out, is thinking about the tenure requirements and knowing what's important to your tenure requirement. So for some tenure committees, you know, they want to make sure that you've published with a university press. That's key. And so it's important to know if that's going to be important to your committee, because you definitely want to seek a university press out as opposed to a commercial academic press. In terms of some of the differences, I would say that one key difference, and this is the reason why committees care about this, is that there is a really rigorous commitment to peer review with university press publishing. So our parent organization that all of us belong to at university presses, it's the Association of University Presses. They put out best practices in peer review. They're not necessarily like mandated guidelines that all presses have to follow, but they do describe best practices that many university presses put into effect. And, you know, we're always using 2 peer reviewers, for example. You have to get the positive sign-off, editorial board approval, faculty board approval. You know, there's a rigorous process in place that most university presses follow. So that is one key difference. And in some ways, I guess it could make it a little bit more challenging because you have to pass that peer review process. But I would also say that at many university presses, you're going to be getting a lot of close attention from your acquisitions editor, a lot of support. Archana used the language of how an acquisitions editor is your advocate at the press, and that's very much the case. So, you know, you can end up having a really close working relationship with whoever you're working with at a university press.
Thank you. Aurora, I'm going to throw this to you. My friend, colleague Mindy Finsky asked, what's the best approach for those working in interdisciplinary research areas in terms of the subject areas that you've brought up? I guess if you're working all over the map, what's the best idea of who to approach and how to write about this?
Sure. Some of it probably is going to depend a little, well, it may depend somewhat on where you are in your career, coming back to this question about tenure and promotion committees and how your interdisciplinary work relates to the department that you are officially in and what those requirements are. So if you are early in your career, it's possible that you need especially to focus on presses that that are known in whatever area your department wants you to be most visible in, whereas later in your career, you might have more flexibility with that. But I do really like the resource with Association of University Presses that I mentioned early in this conversation that Tara sent out a link for. When you're thinking about interdisciplinary work, because you can start to triangulate which presses are active in one or more of the areas that your research touches, so that you can hopefully find an editor who has at least some familiarity, again, with these different multiple areas, and a press that has some expertise in those areas. That being said, I think especially in areas of rhetoric and communication, presses tend to be open to and interested in interdisciplinary research. So you want to be upfront about that. You also want to be clear about how the different audiences intersect, who is the primary audience, who is secondary, what are you doing in order to make your work accessible to those different groups. I'm working with a couple of people in rhetoric of health and medicine right now, and that's been a really interesting conversation because they want to be accessible to a public health audience, even though rhetoric is the primary audience for the book. So those are some of the additional things to think about, but as long as you have a clear vision for the relationship between your different audiences and how the book is going to appeal to them, then I don't think it's a deficit by any means. It's just something that you need to explain well and have conversations about.
Thank you. Kristen, I'm going to throw this to you. This is about university presses and their intended audiences. Rosalie Fisher asked, does a manuscript have to be academic rather than address more layperson general audiences? And I know this can be different for different presses, but you're familiar with the folks here. Can you answer that in sort of a brief way?
Sure. I mean, I would say primary audiences for university presses are usually academic in nature, and then you can break those audiences down to be even more specific based on what disciplines a particular press publishes in. It is not uncommon for university presses to also do some trade publications, although those trade publications do usually have regional interest ties. So here at the University of Alabama, we do a lot of Alabama history and culture, general Deep South history, culture, that sort of thing. We're not just the only university press in the state, but the only book publisher in the state. So we seek to serve that audience as well. If someone was going to approach me with a rhetoric book that they thought was also going to have trade appeal, I certainly wouldn't say no, but I would have a lot of follow-up questions about how you think it's going to be appropriate for a trade audience. So again, that's not a no, but that would probably trigger a lot of follow-up questions from me about your writing style and intended audience, and how you would define the success of this particular book. So hopefully that answers that question in a kind of succinct way.
So, and I mean, again, we want to encourage, you guys are always good about answering questions. If somebody needs something more specific, they can write to one of you later.
Absolutely.
Archna, I'll throw this one to you. This is a really good question in terms of approaching publishing. One of our questioners says an author once told me, or I know that told me, that simultaneous submission of a proposal to multiple presses is standard practice. Is that true? And I guess I want to add on to that. Not only is it true, is there a point in the process where you shouldn't be sending out multiple proposals? What is that? What's the answer to that? How many presses can I deal with at once?
That's a great question. I think at the proposal stage, it is a good idea to send out your proposal to a couple of presses that you're really interested in, to get a sense of, is this a topic? Is this a specific subject that people seem to be interested in? What I will say at the proposal stage, I encourage people to take the time to research presses, to figure out which presses that they're most interested in. So you're not sending out a proposal to 10 presses. That you have a sense of, here are my top 2 or 3 presses. And that can ultimately be reflected in the proposal, especially in that comparable or competing book section. If you're interested in a specific press, it's a good idea to highlight 1 or 2 of their recent titles to showcase how your book will fit into their program. So I think at the proposal stage, sending out to a couple of presses to gauge interest is a good thing. When we get a little bit further down the line, so if an editor is interested in sending out either the proposal or a full manuscript for peer review, this is a question that you want to ask your editor, because different presses have different policies. I will also say that sometimes different editors at the same presses can have different policies when it comes to sending something out for review that may be out in review at another press. So this is something that you definitely want to ask your editor. I will say that, one of the reasons it's important to ask this question is because when we are sending something out for review, we are asking other people to invest their time and their labor in reviewing something closely. And so I guess the last thing I will add is that no matter what stage you're at, transparency is always key. So even at the proposal stage, so if you are sending it out to a couple of different presses, it's always a good idea to be upfront with the editors that you're in contact with at the beginning and then throughout the process as well.
You. Judith, I'm going to turn to you for this one. This is a very specific question asked by one of the people in the VLO, and I'm going to ask you to while you can look at the specifics of the question, I'm wanting to make this general because specific questions they can take to you guys alone. But I think this question has merit as one that lots of people might have to think about. David Enns asked, since I'm working on a lexicon of Christianese that functions as both an academic reference and a springboard for applied resources, homiletics, counseling, worship, what is your perspective on whether such a project should remain under one university press or branch out to different publishers for different audiences? And so, if David needs a really specific answer to his question, he probably wants to take this to you later, or one of you later. But in general, I think it's a good question. If you have a project that has multiple prongs like that, when is it do you decide to go to one place or multiple places? Does that question make sense?
Yes, I think so. I don't know that I have a good sort of like final answer for that. I don't know if I'm understanding correctly. I don't think that you would be able to work with like different presses as like distributing or marketing to different audiences. I don't know that I've ever heard of something like that. I think that there are presses out there that that do reference and sort of have other audiences as well. So I would recommend, looking for that when you're researching your presses, and that might and maybe other people want to correct me on that. That might, in this case, lead you to a press other than a university press. Because there are, reference publishers, textbook publishers that also do monographs that might be able to market in different ways, but they often have editors that work only in one segment. So I think this might take more time and energy to find the appropriate place. I believe that it's out there. I think that you can find them, but I don't know that I have too much insight into that because I've never done anything like that myself, and I've never worked at a press that has done that. So
I really appreciate your response. I want to encourage anyone who has a project like that to talk to the publishers directly, because this might be so specific that it's going to be different answers every time. Tara, I'm going to turn this back to you. This is a really interesting question. How long is one obligated to wait to hear back from a university press with a verdict on a book proposal before taking their silence as an answer and moving on? I even wrote back to this person. I was surprised. I've never heard of a university press ghosting someone, but that happened in this case. How long should they wait, or what should they do if they're not getting a response?
Definitely don't wait a year. I saw that the person said they lost almost a full year waiting. So definitely not that. It would be very reasonable to pull your project prior to that point. I would say that what I would advise here when you're not getting a response from a publisher is to try to email, try to call, try to contact somebody in that way. And if, after a certain point, however long you want to wait, I would say if I were you, I wouldn't want to wait more than 6 to 8 weeks for some kind of confirmation, maybe even less than that, to simply get a confirmation. In terms of a full response to the proposal where, there's feedback and a decision and things like that, I think it's reasonable to wait a bit longer. But, if you haven't heard anything, I think what's important is just to, have your own communication with the publisher. So to say something like, I want to withdraw my submission, and then you've done what you've needed to do on your side of things, and then you can just go ahead and feel free to take that on to another press. And not to be wishy-washy on it, but really that timeline is up to you, how long you're willing to wait, how much you really wanted to work with this particular publisher that you sent the project to. On average, I think most editors are going to try to send at least some kind of confirmation email within 2 to 3 weeks, 2 to 4 weeks, maybe, just depending on the timing of things like maybe they're on vacation time, personal time, or meetings, or a busy time of year, that kind of thing. In terms of a fuller response, if the project is just being internally reviewed by the editor, I think most editors are going to do that work in probably 2 months or so, 8 to 10 weeks, maybe a bit longer. Hopefully most editors will communicate a timeline with you as well and say how long they're going to take. And if something is being externally reviewed, of course, that involves other people. That process takes a bit longer to review a lot of materials. So that could look more like 3 to 4 months or even longer. But yeah, I would say that if you're not hearing anything at all, try to communicate, send another email, do a phone call, something like that. If you don't hear back after whatever period you specify, 6 weeks, write an email, say you're going to withdraw the project and take it somewhere else.
The reason I was surprised at that question, I've dealt with several of you before on ideas and projects, and I've always gotten responses so quickly. It's sort of surprising to hear it would take longer. Got a couple of minutes. I'm going to try to get through a couple of more of these. Aurora, turning back to you. And how much does the fame, credibility, or established status of an author matter in the proposal process relative to the quality of work and ideas? Now, I'm certain you're going to say the quality of work and ideas is important. I guess what I want to know is what this question sort of getting at is a junior scholar, are they going to have a harder time in this process, or does a person who's published, et cetera, 4 books, do they find it easier to breeze through the process? Is there a difference or not?
There might be small differences, but when we're talking about an academic book, we're not looking for any level of fame, certainly. We're looking at the quality of the work. If you are a very junior scholar, it can be helpful to see that you have published 1 or more journal articles, partly because that shows us that you've been through the peer review process before on a smaller scale. And for yourself to go through it on the scale of a journal article before you go through with a whole monograph. So there are certain things like that. Or if you haven't published, we want to see that you're engaging in conferences and that you are part of this community of ideas in some way, that you're not parachuting in from outside and working completely in a bubble. But I'm not making the decision. I'm making the decision based on quality, based on peer review, based on my sense of the audience for the work, rather than on the sort of name recognition of the author. Of course, if you are an established scholar who's, you've written 5 books and you bring number 6 to me, I want to have that conversation. I'm excited about it. It's possible that with that track record, we can move through the proposal process more quickly sometimes. But by the time we get to a full manuscript, everyone's getting the same peer review treatment. And sometimes the revised dissertation goes through more easily than someone's book number 6. It just really depends on the project.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Kristen, I'm going to get this next question to you, and I'm probably going to make this our final question. So I'd ask you to be sort of brief. We're about at the hour-and-a-half mark. I've got to tell you, I've wrote down questions the whole time. I've got tons of questions here, but let's hit this one. I really want to hear this. My project is multimodal. I collected professional level video interviews of participants along with media release forms for each. My idea is to include links to the interviews to supplement the book. Is there something that some publishers might be interested in? And if so, any advice on imparting this in the proposal? And, making this as broad as possible, not just interviews. People might have all types of material now that we can access or point to digitally. So Kristen, should we talk about this? Is this something presses are interested now in doing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. My super short answer is yes, it is possible. And yes, definitely make mention of that in your proposal and convey your intentions as clearly as possible. That being said, there might, need to be some creative problem solving happening there. We at AUPresses have a policy where we don't reproduce any hyperlinks or DOIs in our books whatsoever, not even in notes, not even in bibliographies. And we do this because links can die so easily and become inactive, and then they are completely useless in the text itself. And also people are usually not going from a printed book to a search engine and keying in every single character of a hyperlink and hitting enter. You know, they're Googling the title of a publication or something like that. That being said, I know in the past we have used QR code, we have inserted QR codes into books the same way we would, you know, interior illustrations, and use those to link to online resources, which worked just fine. But there is also still a level of, I don't know, like temporality to QR codes, because they still require a URL, which again can die or become inactive or something like that. I think if I was talking to an author who was really set on having any kind of digital material that lived and was stored online that was associated with the book, my advice would be to set up your own website that you manage and you maintain, and pick a super simple URL, you know, that isn't going to go, it's not going to become defunct just by default. And we can say somewhere in the book, you know, please go to this website, such and such.com, for supplementary material. We'll mention specifically throughout the text when we're referencing particular videos or audio recordings or something like that. But that being said, don't expect your publisher to offer to create a website or maintain a website for you. We're not website creators, we're not content creators. We don't have the, you know, expertise to teach you how to build a website or something like that. So again, it's entirely possible, but I think it's just going to take some troubleshooting to find a format that is the most appropriate and the most like solid for, you know, online material.
Thank you. I really appreciate, I want to thank all of the speakers for the insightful presentations. I'm getting feedback already from folks that they're really appreciative of it. I learned a lot. I've got some questions I'm going to be throwing you guys' way later. I mean, wish we had even more time. So I want to thank you guys for your help. I know this took time out of your day. I appreciate the audience for being here and engaging in this question.